Welcome back to our Educational Diagnosticians series. This is our episode 2, centered around test user qualifications. So we're going to be exploring some different topics related to this. We're going to look at the different qualification categories that some of the test companies use, review different types of tests that fall into these categories. And then we'll also be talking about some of the best practices, because just because a test company will sell us something or tell us that we're okay to use it doesn't necessarily mean that we really should be. So we need to think about some of those best practice kinds of situations. So when we look at the qualification systems that are used by different test companies, they are somewhat standardized, but definitely not completely. They're not uniform. Even with using some of the same ratings, they don't necessarily mean the same thing. So we need to make sure that from company to company, we know exactly what that is. And you can find these on the different companies' websites. You can actually print out a list of the different qualification levels that they have. And the companies will actually make somebody from your district or your co-op, whoever's doing the ordering, submit their qualifications to the company to make sure that they can actually purchase those assessments. Now then it's left to us to make sure that the people who then check out the test kit and say, I'm going to be giving this, truly do have the qualification levels that are needed in order to use them. So we have some different kinds of setups with the different companies. One uses an ABC rating, one uses an ABCN rating, another uses ABCS, and then healthcare provider, which is kind of a different category altogether. And then we have yet another company who uses a system where they rate things as either unrestricted, low, medium, or high as far as the test levels. So we're going to hit some of the most common test companies that we tend to use within school districts. I'm sure there are others out there as well, but they are all going to have kind of a similar setup where we need to look at who can purchase and use the different assessments. So we're going to start by looking at some of the most common test companies that our school districts and cooperatives use to purchase materials. Western Psychological Services, or WPS, uses an ABCN kind of rating system. So A would be the lowest level of qualification needed, and for A items, WPS does not require any sort of degree, any sort of training, but they limit you to being able to purchase books and instructional materials. And this is so that, if somebody wants to purchase things for homeschooling, they don't necessarily have to have any sort of degree or training to provide homeschooling. So this way they can get access to those instructional materials. A B-level product requires at least a bachelor's in education or psychology, school counseling, occupational therapy, SLP, social work, gen ed teacher, special ed teacher, lots of different levels of just having that base bachelor's level degree. And they also don't require any additional training of any kind during this in this level of qualification. The understanding is that if you've gone to school for training in one of these areas, that you've got some background, you've got some training, so they're not requiring anything else. You can get access through WPS to screening kinds of tests, counseling materials, instructional materials, obviously books, and then most achievement tests that are sold through WPS also fall into this category. Now again, I'm going over the requirements of the test company, but there still needs to be an understanding that We only use things that we are comfortable with giving and we feel like we've got the background to be able to administer and interpret, which part of the background that you need are some of the things that we're going to go through in this series to get you ready to feel confident to give certain kinds of assessments. C-level assessments require master's degrees either in psychology, school counseling, social work, teaching of any kind, occupational therapy. There are a lot of different areas, but having that master's degree is either required, or you can have a bachelor's level degree, but then also have either licensure or certification. And when you have that licensure or certification, typically there is a requirement that you've got some experience or training and assessment in order to be able to hold that position, hold that licensure. So if you are a licensed educator and there's some experience in assessment or training that was required, then that would also satisfy that level of qualification as well. C-level assessments through Western include pretty much everything else except for some of the neuropsychological instruments are not included. They bump up to that next level, as well as any advanced psychiatric kinds of assessments, which typically none of us are going to give anyway, so we wouldn't need to have access to them. And then their next level is an N level. Don't know why we don't have a D, but we moved to N. But at the N level, there is a requirement for having your doctorate in psychology or some kind of related field, or you can have a master's degree in one of those fields, but you need to have at least some specialized training. They say at least a weekend workshop in neuropsychological assessments. And if you are at that N level, then you pretty much can purchase anything through Western by having those qualifications. Pearson is another company that many of our schools purchase a lot from, and Pearson uses an ABC rating. Again, theirs is very similar to Western as far as that A level doesn't really have any requirement as far as degree or training. B level, instead of having a B level that is bachelor's, their B level assessments require a master's, or, so again, this is a kind of a caveat here, or you can have that certification or membership in a professional organization that would require you to have that kind of training and assessment, or you may also have some formal supervised training in that area as well. So that would satisfy that requirement. And so you can see from the chart there are a lot of different assessments that through Pearson fall into a B category, including a lot of our rating scales, our academic assessments, some of the speech and language kinds of assessments, some of the motor assessments that are out there, but they would all fall within that B category. Now the expectation is that what you have in the top level of B, so what your background is in, what your training is in, what your membership is in, then would correspond to what you're seeing in the tests. So I personally would not feel comfortable, even though it's a B assessment and I would meet the B requirements, I wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable giving, for example, a Self-5. Number one, because I've never given one, I've not had the practice, but also because it's sometimes difficult when we are giving an assessment, if it's not in our area of expertise, then interpreting the results of the assessment. I can tell you what a standard score means, whether it's good, whether it's bad, but being able to really identify what the different subtests are measuring and have that background to be able to explain it is a totally different story. So again, staying within our own lane, making sure that we've got good background and training to give, to use, to interpret any of these kinds of instruments is a really important caveat to that. C-level assessments for Pearson either require that doctorate level training, or you need to have licensure or certification. So it doesn't give you very crystal clear lines. It gives you lots of ways to justify having access to different level assessments, so which is even more important why we need to look at that best practices piece and the legal piece. Because one of the things that we never want to do is picture ourselves sitting on a witness stand defending a test that we gave, why we gave it, what it really means, what the results mean, what the validity is of a particular test or anything like that. If you can't feel comfortable explaining this to a lawyer when they're interrogating you, then you're probably not ready to give a particular assessment. So you can also see that some of the things that fall into that C level for Pearson include different IQ tests, some of the more intensive kind of projective measures for personality assessment, some of the neuropsychological kinds of tests, and then some of the tests that are used in much more of a clinical setting, such as the MMPI, things that tend to be used not necessarily in schools. Now, I think you still have some interpretation of those instruments in some school districts, depending on the student, but a lot of times you're involving an outside professional because it really is not the same as kind of our standard battery of what we tend to use with students. So our next company is ProEd, and this, I want to make sure you understand, I'm not endorsing any of these companies. I just know that these are the catalogs that show up at our offices with all of the different materials that we tend to use. ProEd is another one that has an ABC requirement, and it's very similar when you look across the columns, very similar to what Pearson uses as far as their requirement levels. They do list things a little bit differently though, because under the ProEd requirements, they list the Autism Spectrum Rating Scale and the CAS-2 as C items when they are more like a B item on some of our other test companies. So I think it's very important for us to always check with that particular company. You would think that they would be completely standardized across those companies, but they're not. Riverside we use, mainly most districts are using Riverside for the Woodcock-Johnson, for the Woodcock-Munoz, or any of the other tests that they have. They have fewer tests that they actually offer, but those are very commonly used across the state of Indiana. So Riverside has a setup that's kind of similar but different, different descriptors of the different categories. So unrestricted doesn't have any sort of degree or training requirement, but there really aren't a lot of products that are at that unrestricted level. In the low level of qualification, you can have a bachelor's level of training in a lot of different areas, or you can also have certification in either occupational therapy, physical therapy, or another medical field and have some training that might be needed. The product that they specifically list that takes that level of requirement is the BDI-2. And I think a lot of our preschool teams are using this. And preschool evaluations, although I don't agree that it's necessarily best practice, but a lot of our preschool teams, they're not required by law when they're looking at language, speech, or developmentally delayed to have a psychologist as part of that multidisciplinary team. And so making sure that we've got somebody who can meet those requirements and be able to give some of those developmental inventories are really, that's a good thing to have that level of qualification. At the medium level, you need to have a bachelor's degree or higher, or you can have formal supervised training that is specific to assessment and some supervised training, or licensure or certification in your field. So again, the expectation is if I have that certification, licensure, or I'm a member of this organization that expects that I have this kind of training, then I would meet those criteria. So they list the Woodcock-Johnson Achievement, the Woodcock-Johnson Oral Language, and also the Woodcock-Munoz Language Survey as tests that require that medium level of qualification. And then for the higher level of qualification, you need to either have a master's or a doctorate in an appropriate field. And so they specifically note school psychology, clinical psychology, or licensure in a related field, or certification and full membership in a professional organization that would be related. So again, you could technically meet certain criteria, but maybe not feel comfortable in giving some of the assessments or being able to sit on that witness stand and defend your results. So the Woodcock-Johnson test of cognitive abilities falls into that high category. And then also the WJ4 tests of cognitive and academic development, which I've never used, but is another one of their tests that they sell. So those all fall into that high category. And then finally, we're going to look at PAR. And PAR has a similar setup as well. They have the ABC, but they also have an S in there, which is kind of a bump between the A and the B. So for A-level products, you don't need any degree or training. You don't have to have specific qualifications. S has a couple of assessments that they specifically identify as you just need to have some kind of degree or certification or licensure in a field, along with some training and expertise in assessment. So again, we're going to work on building that training background for people who may feel that, I've not really had that formal training, to make sure that you can get up to speed on certain kinds of assessments. They list the MIGDAS and the PCSI. So the MIGDAS is an autism evaluation. So thinking about that, you may, if you've got background in working with autism and you've got some training and assessment, but not necessarily a higher degree, you can still participate in things like the MIGDAS in being able to use that with students. A B level does take a degree from a 4-year college, so it can be, bachelor's level background with some completion of appropriate coursework. So we're talking about things like coursework in assessment or in statistics, having some understanding of that assessment kind of process. And again, you could have licensure or certification that has some of that expectation as well, because some of you have gotten your training not in college, but you've gotten it elsewhere. You've gotten it in-house, you've gotten it at workshops, things like that. So it does allow for us to have some flexibility there, but the underlying point is that we do have it, right? We have the qualifications, we have the background and understanding to be able to use those assessments. So some of the things that PAR lists, the Adaptive Behavior Assessment System, they also list the CTONI, the Comprehensive Test of Nonverbal Intelligence, which is, it's an intellectual assessment, but it is very different than giving some of our more comprehensive cognitive assessments. As well as the UNIT, another nonverbal intelligence test, and then the YCAT, the Young Children's Achievement Test, all fall into their category of B. And then C requires everything that B does, except for they do require some kind of advanced degree. So master's degree, doctorate degree, education specialist degree, that would expect that you're going to have some of that advanced training. And again, they say, or that licensure or certification kind of process. So when we talked in the initial series about certification, and Indiana does not have a current certification process. There is a national certification process, but it's not recognized anywhere in the state of Indiana. So I think as this certification system kind of builds in Indiana, you may see some very specific coursework related to this that's offered, as well as some different requirements that may fall in line with some of these different categories, and they may be slightly different. We'll have to kind of wait and see how that unfolds. So the different test companies do require you to complete those forms to kind of prove your level, right? And a lot of the test companies also offer continuous learning. They offer workshops. They offer different methods for you to increase that user level and to satisfy those requirements. So take advantage of those things as they come available as well. So looking at best practices and really some of the cautions we need to think about. You need to have a good understanding of psychometric principles. So validity, reliability of a test, understanding retest reliability, understanding the effects of using the same or a similar assessment with a student too soon. How does that affect things? These are the kinds of things that you may be asked if, again, you're ever in that unfortunate situation of having to be on the witness stand. So you want to make sure that you understand those things, because that will help guide what data that we use, what data that we choose, what tests we might use. We want to make sure that we have some background in that. And that may become one of our future sessions as well, depending on what the need is out there from the field. It's also important that you know and you practice test administration procedures. So never get a new, it's all wonderful when we get that brand new test and the shrink wrap and unwrap that and think, I'm going to go forth and test children with this. You got to test some willing victims first, right? You test your kids, you test your husband, you test your cat if you need to, but you practice the test administration. You don't want to be fumbling through when you're working with students. And some tests are more complicated than others. So when we start looking at those standardized testing procedures, we know that some are difficult to give and some are very straightforward, start to finish, you never deviate. So it's important to really know all of that and to stick with those procedures. If you don't stick with the procedures, you really don't have good data to stand on, and you're going to have a hard time defending it. We also want to make sure that as the multidisciplinary team kind of plans its attack of the evaluation, that we know who's doing what. We know who is covering what areas, who's administering what tests, and thinking about maybe if we need one test to be given before we give another. Sometimes you can give a test and realize I don't need to look any further into that, or maybe I don't need to give a cognitive assessment if this test turned out to be within the average range. We always know that there are some things that are determined by the data that came before them. So making sure that we really know who's doing what and when. It's important to know that if my another one of my M-team members is coming to work with a student, I don't want to test them on the same day. That's going to be overwhelming. I want to make sure that that we know who's doing what and how to get it done on time. And that I'm not testing the same thing that somebody else is testing. That's really important too, to make sure that we're not spending unnecessary time testing the same things, but we're also making sure that everything does get covered. We also need to make sure that we have a really good understanding of what a test is measuring. My early years before going to graduate school, before becoming a school psychologist, I worked as a psychological assistant, I think was my title. And in that role, I worked with a clinical psychologist and I administered tests. I really didn't have a good understanding of what that test was measuring. I didn't write reports, I didn't make recommendations. Boy, it almost sounds like an ideal job, right? But I really didn't have a great understanding of what it was measuring. And I think that's really important because understanding that piece will drive our report. It will drive our recommendations for the student. It will help us to explain things in a way that the parents, the students, and our other teachers who are serving the student can really understand it. But it starts with us really having a good idea of what the test is measuring. And if you don't understand it, then you shouldn't give it. I mean, if you can't really give somebody a good explanation of what a particular test does, we don't cross into that lane yet. Get more training, beef up your skills, and then move into that kind of role. Again, we're all trying to tackle the current situation and plan for the future and make sure that we are serving students to the best of our ability. A couple of other things to consider. Educational diagnosticians can be part of the M team in different ways than what we're used to doing. So that academic assessment is kind of a standard for a lot of diagnosticians, but we could also look into maybe doing some testing to support different areas, maybe doing some testing to get some baseline data for our occupational therapists or physical therapists or speech language pathologists, looking into the rating scales, helping to coordinate some of that, completing different kinds of observations. And then again, I know I mentioned in the first part of the series that recommendation piece, helping to link the results of the evaluation to now what do we do? Now how can we support the student? That is a huge part of the role of an educational diagnostician. Thank you for being part of this series again. Thank you for being part of this learning cohort. We'll continue to add to the series and grow together, and look forward to seeing you back.